There seems to be two things that Riot loves, and these two things are money and dumbass mechanics that make the game absolutely shit. Take this for an example. Valorant is a game all about precise gunplay, and yet Valorant decides to add some of the most unprecise and illogical mechanics I've ever seen in an FPS. And these mechanics are bloom, static crosshairs, and movement error. You see, there are two types of crosshairs any game can have. They're either going to be static or dynamic. Okay, I already know what you're going to ask. You're going to be like, yo, what is a dynamic crosshair and what is a static crosshair? So static is something that doesn't move, and dynamic is something that does move. Or in other words, static is something that doesn't change, and dynamic is something that does change. So putting this into a crosshair standpoint, a static crosshair doesn't move with your bullet's recoil. Instead, it stays locked at the center of your screen. The problem is that it's not actually showing where you're aiming. For example, look at the spray pattern. When you fire your first few bullets, the game lets you be somewhat accurate. But then after that, look at the crosshair and then look at where your bullets are going. What is this? Why are the bullets landing here while your crosshair is here? Clearly, the crosshair isn't showing where you're aiming. Instead, it shows the center of your screen, like I said before. But that means that your crosshair isn't showing where you're looking, which makes zero sense. The reason why this is weird is because in every other game I have played, regardless of it being an FPS, if it's first person, the center of the screen is where the player is looking. This is gaming 101. So then why does Valorant do this? I honestly don't know, but I do know that they need to fix it. The fix is simple. All they have to do is change the crosshair from static, so a non-changing crosshair, to a dynamic one, a changing crosshair. One that changes with your gun's recoil, so it actually displays your character's POV and not this weird static view. Almost every other big FPS shooter has a dynamic crosshair. A dynamic crosshair tracks where your recoil goes because that's where you're going to be aiming. Now, games who have this are Call of Duty, Fortnite, Apex Legends, Marvel Rivals, Overwatch. All of them share the same dynamic crosshair, and they also share something else in common that I'll mention later. But now let's move on to the next mechanic that makes Valorant so inconsistent with your aim, and that is bloom. But then your next question should be, what is bloom? And the answer to that is, bloom is a mechanic used to determine where your bullets go when you fire. So for example, if you're standing still and shoot 5 bullets, each time you shoot a bullet, it will randomly be given a position in your bloom region. Now, a bloom region is the area where your bullets can possibly land, and the size of your bloom region varies depending on what gun you're using or if you're standing still or not. So then why is bloom bad for Valorant? Well, since Valorant is a precise shooter and it's all about precise gunplay, bloom makes your fights less precise and skilled and more luck-based, which runs contrary to the precise gunplay. Now, let's run a quick scenario to better understand this. So let's say you line up your crosshair with an enemy's head and shoot. Now, depending on the distance you are from your opponent, there's a high chance you might miss your shot simply because the game decided that your bullet would be a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right of where you were aiming, and that is solely just because of bloom. Now think about it, you could line up your shot perfectly but still miss just because of bloom. And the worst thing is that bloom impacts your aim more the further you are from your target. So I hope you can see why bloom shouldn't exist in a game like Valorant, which is literally all about precise gunplay. Okay, so now let's move on to the next and final mechanic, which is movement error. Movement error is the #1 problem in Valorant, slightly above bloom and static crosshairs. You see, every time you move in Valorant, your accuracy drops, and even when you're standing still, your accuracy isn't 100%. It actually depends on the gun you're using. For example, if you're using a Vandal, the bloom is a 25-degree cone around your gun, meaning any bullet that you shoot can land anywhere inside this cone. The problem is that the further you are away from your target, the less accurate your gun is going to be, because the bloom region is much bigger the further you are away from your target. But look at what happens when I move while shooting. The bloom region shifts from this to this. Now I only moved for a second, and my bloom region acts as if I'm running and gunning, like a neon main. But that's the thing, if I simply click a movement key while shooting, my bloom region changes. Why? To obviously prevent running and gunning, and I respect that logic. I mean, Neon is a running and gunning agent, and she is one of the most annoying agents, so it's fair to prevent running and gunning by adding
adding movement error. But my question is, why make it so sensitive, or why make it so aggressive? It's either you don't move and are around 90% accurate, or you do move and now you're like 2% accurate. And that's the problem. It makes gunfights, 1, less realistic, and 2, less precise. Going against the precise shooter. I mean, if they simply give a player a 0.5% grace period before movement error is applied, that would make a gunfight, 1, more dynamic, and 2, more fun, instead of I stand here like a drone and shoot. Like, realistically, does this look cool or fun compared to every other FPS? No, it doesn't. I personally like a little bit of movement in my fights. It adds a dynamic element to it, cause realistically, no one is standing still during a fight, and no human on earth is tap strafing in the middle of a fight. I want you to find me a video of a person tap strafing in a war, and I'll give you my PC. Like, you know what I'm saying? Okay, I'm not gonna do that, but still, you get what I'm saying. I mean, look at Valorant's own animations. Technically speaking, these characters would be missing their shots because of movement error. They're going against their own game's logic in their own animations. And on top of that, every FPS shooter goes against this logic. Having movement error is not a core concept in FPS shooters. Honestly, almost every FPS shooter wants you to move so that the fight feels more dynamic. I mean, Fortnite, Apex, Overwatch, Marvel Rivals, literally every game we play that is a first-person shooter has a dynamic crosshair and no movement error. You see, with Valorant, they break the rule of mutually exclusive trios, where only 2 can be true at once, or inadvertently only 2 can be false at once. But most importantly, not all 3 can be true or false at the same time. For a game to have a fun aiming style, that has to be consistent. These are the 3 main pillars that they stand on. Is the crosshair static or is it dynamic? Then there's movement error, if there is or if there isn't. And then if there is or isn't bloom. If bloom is false and movement error is false, you have to have a static crosshair. If a static crosshair is false, so in other words you have a dynamic crosshair and you don't have movement error, then bloom has to be true. And most games follow the criteria that I just mentioned. No static crosshair, no movement error, but they do have bloom. Examples of these games are, as I mentioned before, Fortnite, Apex, Overwatch. No movement error, no static crosshair, but they do have bloom, keeping true to the mutually exclusive trios concept. 2 have to be true, or in our case, 2 have to be false, for the game's aiming system to be consistent and to also be fun. Because if something is consistent, then it is fun because you see progression. But look at Valorant. Instead, they have all 3 true. Movement error, true. Bloom, true. Static crosshair, true. This goes against the rule, and that's why some days you play amazing, but the next day you play bad. It's not about you being inconsistent necessarily, it's more about the game not being consistent. Think about it, you could aim at the same spot, but simply because of bloom, a random number generator just chooses where your bullet's gonna go. So one day you would have hit that shot, but another day the game said no, you're not gonna hit that shot. And also taking into account ping and many other things, it gives a lot of inconsistencies. So if I was Riot Games or Valorant, I would change the crosshair to be a dynamic crosshair, and then I would adjust movement error to be a little more consistent so that you can move just a little bit when you shoot, but it still stops you from running and gunning like a neon main. So to conclude, to truly fix Valorant's aiming problem, we need to make the game's aiming system more consistent. And to do that, they need to stick by the rule of mutually exclusive trios, because you can't have your cake and eat it too.